I'm Scott L. Miller. This is my life living in León, Nicaragua. Today I want to talk a little bit about the high cost of land transfer taxes, especially on the beaches, and how this plays into the general lack of liquidity on the market. It's something that people may not think of too often and could impact a little bit about real estate thinking. So just something worth paying attention to, and something that I don't think about too often because we're not looking at buying and selling on the beaches. We're not flipping, but for those who are thinking that that's something they want to do, this is a factor you need to consider and will help explain why real estate works the way that it does here in Nicaragua. So we're going to talk about that right after the call. Here in Nicaragua, on a lot of the beaches, if you're going to be looking at buying land, you're often working with an indigenous lease. And this is a little bit complicated, and some people are really scared off by this, and I think that's great because it makes it more available for those of us who seek these out. We like the extra protection and oversight that that system brings, but it does come with a cost, and that cost comes in the form of higher taxes, an entire extra category of taxes, indigenous taxes, that don't apply to other circumstances. Now, you can think of it less as a tax and more of a cost for the lease, if that makes you feel better. But the reality is it's the same thing either way. It's something you have to pay when you're going to be purchasing property that is in an indigenous area, an indigenous lease zone. And for those who are unaware, I live here in León, and our coastal region here is all indigenous controlled. Now, not all of it, but a large portion of it. So a lot of places that you'll be looking can be affected by this. And now the simple answer that people are going to see when looking at this from a distance is, sure, you got to pay a little bit more in your taxes, but how does that really play out? What really does that impact in the long run because prices are so low? Well, first of all, prices are partially so low because of this. The higher your taxes, the lower the value of the land that you are taxing. It's a natural opposition force, right? As you increase the tax, if you were to tax something by 100%, the amount you could pay to buy it is dramatically reduced, right? You have to put the money into taxes. You don't have as much money to spend on the land. If you were to raise it to some astronomical number, say 1,000%, you had to pay 10 times the value of the land in taxes, it would basically stop land transfers, right? And land would become essentially worthless. People would be unwilling to pay much of anything for it because you'd say, well, my piece of land's worth $100, my neighbor's is worth 110. You'd say this one cost 1,000, that one cost 1,100. That's noticeably so much more because we're multiplying everything by 10, right? So little increases would really be painful, so you wouldn't do them, right? So I say 1,100, it would become 10,000, it would become 11,000, right? Anyway, you can do the math. The point being, as you raise taxes, it puts a damper on prices. And as prices become more difficult, so two things happen. One, the prices go down. Right, so we see lower prices overall, and the second thing that we see is liquidity goes down. Right, so both of these things are affected. Normally, if you're in a market without high taxes or with no taxes, lower price generally leads to higher liquidity, and on its own, low price will encourage higher liquidity. If houses only cost $100 or empty lots only cost $100, then people are much more likely to have that money at their disposal, and they're much more likely to go out and do a purchase. This is clearly not the only thing that affects the liquidity in a market. Another thing that's a very impactful factor here in Nicaragua is that getting a property loan is very, very difficult and costly. The rates that you have to pay here are many times higher than when you get in places like the United States. The U.S. actually has incredibly low loan rates, very low interest rates on property. That helps encourage high liquidity in the market because people who have no access to the amount of money necessary to buy a home can often buy one, right? You have people who end up owning many homes throughout their lifetimes and never acquiring enough money to ever own a single one. And they spend their entire lives simply paying interest, and eventually the bank owns the house at the end of the day. But that's a common thing. Here in Nicaragua, most people are not able to take out loans or would never consider doing so, and so end up having to pay cash. So it's much later in life if you're able to buy a house at all, but when you do buy it, you tend to own it outright and then keep it in the family so you can reduce any transfer taxes or eliminate transfer taxes. Now, of course, in the cities and stuff, the taxes are much lower. But if you're out on the beach, you have this extra, and I'm going to state this number, and you need to stop and think about it for a second. It does depend on where you are. There's a lot of factors, and I don't have all the information. It's something you have to discuss with the indigenous community. But roughly the amount of taxes you have to pay, not fees, not any of those stuff, just the taxes to the indigenous community, not even the normal taxes, just the taxes to the indigenous community is an additional 15%. That is not a trivial number. If you're buying a house for $100,000, you do all your normal fees, you calculate everything else in, you suddenly have an extra $15,000 you have to pay. Now, it may not sound crippling, and for most people it's not, but no matter what you're doing, the percentage is noticeable. What that really means is if you're going to go out and buy a house, right, you're going to go spend that $100,000, that means you have to put in not only the normal amount that you calculate, however much tax and overhead and effort that you have to build into the cost of getting that house, say $10,000 of tax and effort, but you have to tack on another 15% on top of that. And then what that means is if you were going to sell that house and attempt to recoup the cost that you put into it, you would need to get something in the range of $125,000 from the next person if you were able to sell it the day after you bought it. Every day that you hold on to a house, you may be able to get value out of it, and you may perceive that as a good thing, and it's worthwhile for the fact that you don't have to pay rent or something. But if it's purely an investment, only looking at it from its investment value, not from its ability to live in value, right? So we're assuming like a second house to make this a little bit more simple to think about. But if you were going to buy it and flip it, that means that you have to get a 25% increase just to break even if you're going to sell it and complete the sale on the next day. Every day that you hold on to the house is lost revenue, and you have to calculate that against your baseline, roughly 10% per year, that you would have to gain. So if you were to sell that house at the end of a year, you would have to take the $125,000 that you spent on what was a $100,000 property, find out what 10% of that is, which is $12,500, tack that on, and you'd have to get $137,500 at the end of 1 year to have broken even in a realistic way. So that means you, to actually see any kind of profit, and remember, you're taking a risk on flipping a house, right? You put money in, and sometimes you won't be able to sell it. Sometimes something goes wrong. Sometimes you have maintenance nightmares. And we're assuming not a single penny spent for maintenance or upkeep or cuidadors or anything like that for the entire year, which is not realistic at all. In order to get enough profit at the end of the year to potentially justify the risk you've taken, you would need to get higher of $140,000 to $150,000 for a property you spent $100,000 on just 1 year before to have any hope of justifying flipping that house. Now, under normal circumstances, you don't flip a house and just buy it and sell it again. Normally, you put money into it to justify why it's going to sell for a higher price. Anything you're going to do to improve a house, if you're going to spend $10,000 plus several months of your effort in improving a house, you have to calculate what that costs you. That might be an additional $20,000. Now, in order to sell that improved house, plus make your profit, you're needing to sell it pretty close to $170,000 if you can do all that work and get it flipped within a year. As you can imagine, that's a pretty hard thing to do. Look at a property that you were willing to spend $100,000 on, hope that you got it at a good enough deal that wasn't being gringo priced, right? In many cases, people are spending $100,000 but actually only getting a property worth $40,000. So you have to be super careful, and that's one of the big risks that you're taking, that you may be purchasing far above market value, and then hope that you can really quickly improve it, get it back on the market, and get it sold and closed within a tiny period of time, and you have to have this huge increase. Flipping houses under normal circumstances is a challenging thing to do. People who are good at it can make good money, but generally they have a ton of skill, a lot of money that they can put in when they start, and they're still needing to get lucky. People who are good, yeah, it is a very viable thing. Generally, they're doing so in markets where the cost of houses is going up at a pretty predictable rate. It's always some risk, but they're playing with the market, saying, well, they're going to buy it low, they're going to do a bunch of stuff to improve it, they're hopefully going to earn labor time, right? Whoever's buying the house is going to essentially pay them for the labor of improving it. They're going to cover the cost of the materials that they put into improving it. They're going to cover the cost of the original house. And then they're going to make money by hopefully showing it better than they did, not being pressured into giving such a deal as when they got it. And hopefully that the market will go up during that time, and they will ride that increasing wave. Well, here in Nicaragua, the market is not going up and has not for a long time. It is going down at a very, very slow pace, but it's just tiny bit trickling down. So any property you have owned over the last several years is probably worth just a tiny bit less today, not more. And there's no liquidity. So if you're going to buy a house and try to flip it, you're not trying to flip it in months. You're hoping to be able to flip it over a period of years or decades, during which time we're currently seeing a decrease. Now, we may see an increase at some point during those decades, but for every year you hold on to a house, you're losing roughly 10%. That's just basic investment numbers, right? I have lots of videos that explain how to figure out a baseline of what business investing is like. But that means if you're stuck holding on to a house for, say, 20 years, you have to sell it for 4 to 5 times the price you originally paid for it to cover your cost, if you haven't had to spend a penny the entire time on cuidadores or maintenance or anything like that. Suddenly those numbers start to sound insane if that's what you're trying to do. Now, if you're not buying for investment purposes and you're using it to live in, you don't need to make profit on it. But the point is, why is liquidity so low, and how is it affected by these taxes? If you didn't have those taxes, if you didn't have any taxes or any cost of doing a land transfer, then buying a house for $100,000, if you could flip it tomorrow and sell it for $105,000, well, it might be worth it. You only made 5%, but you could do it in a matter of a week or two. So you might be able to take that risk, right? Maybe you're able to pressure someone into selling for $100,000 because they don't know how to advertise the house. You have a great advertising mechanism. Maybe in a couple days you can run in, paint the house, clean things up, take great pictures, add nice lights, and for a tiny investment, get it to where you can make a few $1,000s in a very short period of time. In markets where the prices are going up, houses are in demand, they can flip very quickly. That can make sense and at least be a plausible possibility. But here in Nicaragua, it's really not. So when you're buying a house, we tell people, of course, that the market is not going up. Don't look for those increases like you expect. And you don't have liquidity. So if you decide you need to get out of a house, you're probably stuck with it. And there's nothing you're going to be able to do unless you're willing to take a huge bath. And even there, like I said, most foreigners are buying houses at many times their value or much higher than their real value. So even if they're willing to take a bath of 50%, you may still be trying to sell a house above its market value. So that can be very disenchanting and very financially scary for someone who could be tied down to a place. Normally we're used to, well, whatever we put into a house, if we needed it in some emergency, and we could pull it back out again. We look at homes as sort of a wealth battery. We say wealth store. Batteries are a thing that stores things. But if you think about a battery as a type of power store, right? We put energy in, we trickle it in over a period of time, and then we can trickle it out or suddenly unload it pretty quickly, more or less. Houses kind of work that way. They're not designed as a long-term flexible store, but they do have a certain amount of equity that we're able to store in them over time. And if you're earning extra money, you can put more in a little bit faster. If you can slow that down, if for some reason you need more liquidity in your own capital. And there are times you can take out home equity lines of credit and take money out, put it back in, and have kind of an ebb and flow. You can use a house much like a wealth battery if you live in North America under normal circumstances. And so we're used to thinking of homes this way. When you're in Nicaragua, you don't have those options. You can't sell it to get your wealth back out of it in any predictable way. You can't predict how much someone's going to be willing to pay for it in any reasonable way. And you can't get home equity lines of credits and things like that. You can't prove how much equity you have in a house. You can't prove how much equity the house should have in total. None of that exists. And so banks can't look at a house and say, oh yeah, you've got this great collateral. They can't sell it either. Right, so they're in the same boat that you are. And so it is, while a house remains some amount of wealth store, it is not the wealth battery that Americans and Canadians so ingrained view houses as. And that's an important thing to internalize, that a house here does not have the same financial advantages that you're used to. You can't put in $500,000 into your equity of your house and sit there going, whew, I got access to that $500,000 within a week or two anytime I need it in case of an emergency. In North America, you can run really lean on your financial resources as long as what financial resources you have are tied up in property. You can always find a way to get the money back out of that if you needed to, right, in a pinch. Here we don't have that. So instead, people often hold bank accounts or cash for what little bit of wealth store they need for when they need liquidity, because they don't have access to something that is more of an investment that is able to then release some of that liquidity when necessary. So all these things impact the market and explain why, one, just because of the mechanisms here, liquidity is low, but also why on the beaches where you would expect there to be a higher turnover, more opportunity for buying, maybe improving and reselling, couldn't be very difficult. That extra 15% tax can be crippling. It's also worth noting that it's a 15% tax on the perceived transaction fee. You have to be careful, because if you get a really good deal, while you may only pay, some tiny amount for a property, if the Indigenous community does not believe you, they may tax you on a number you didn't actually spend. And because there are so many people who are, hiding their financial attractions from the Indigenous community, in order to lower the number, it is reasonable for them to suspect that this is happening, because it does happen quite often. That is not disclosing anything that is secret. They know that people are trying to hide those numbers. People know that they're trying to catch them hiding numbers, and so forth. So it's something you do have to worry about. If you're overspending, you're probably safe. They're going to tax you on what you've actually spent. But if you are getting an amazing deal, you may end up with a higher tax rate than you actually are supposed to have. It is kind of negotiable under some circumstances. So if you're spending something just outrageously huge, you're dropping $1 million on the beach, well, they'll probably work with you because they want that transaction to go through. And they know you're already paying 10 times what the property's worth. So they're 15% is inflated by massive amounts, right? They're willing to take a cut in most circumstances in order to make sure that that transaction completes. But those kinds of taxes naturally put the brakes, put the dampers on market liquidity. The whole idea of flipping houses quickly is basically kiboshed, because anyone coming in is going to be looking for deals logically. They don't want to overspend on the market. And just because it costs you a lot of money to acquire, pay the taxes, fix up, and protect a house over a period of time doesn't mean that the value of the house has gone up because of that. It's the same house generally that you bought at the lower price before. So even if you paid the right amount, $100,000 is the actual value of the property and house, that's all it's worth to the next person. So there's no reason, there's no incentive for them to pay extra to you when they could go buy anywhere on any beach something of the same quality and size and whatever for about the same, more or less, right? So that's why we're so used to this not being a factor in North America that it's easy to overlook that this is a significant factor here, and explains to some degree this, especially combined with the banks and the general lack of excess funds available to most Nicaraguans. They don't have the cash to go out and buy houses in most cases. Getting loans is all but impossible, and this immediate tax, which is not crippling on its own, just makes it that the idea of buying and selling houses quickly or much at all really doesn't happen. The natural extension of this is that most Nicaraguans look at the purchase of property as a permanent decision. They look at buying property because it's going to be something they keep for the rest of their lives and pass on to their children. That is normally where it goes. Now, if you come along and are willing to buy it and you're willing to pay those taxes, many Nicaraguans are flabbergasted and don't know what to do. But those who are not overly surprised are often willing to sell to you because they realize it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to unload something that they may otherwise be stuck with once they realize that their kids may not be interested in it, or they don't use it the way that they thought they would, or maybe they would like to move and didn't think they would ever have that opportunity without having to keep this house and pay for it without living in it. So it is possible to buy property. But if you think you're going to buy and then sell again, you're in for a surprise, right? It's the external money coming in from expats who are willing to buy in a market that generally doesn't offer enough liquidity for locals to be able to have an ongoing real estate market of their own is a miracle in itself, and provides what little bit of liquidity we see in the upper end housing market. In the super low end market, houses approach free and often are not taxed. Those are not houses that expats, even expats on extreme budgets, would ever consider. I don't know any expat that would ever even entertain the idea of those types of properties. But once we're getting up into those 20s and 30s of thousands of dollars, then you're talking about houses that locals have paid those taxes on. And most of them are off beach, right? So they don't have the super high taxes, but they still have that difficulty in getting a loan. So the liquidity stays very low. So for those who are often, and I talk to people just constantly about living on the beach or buying property, and it's very difficult to convey that if you buy, you're making what is essentially a permanent decision, or you're making a decision that your money is going to be at extreme risk of either being tied up or lost because you have to take such a cut. So before you go and buy, remember, you're going to have taxes and factors that are going to limit your ability to resell again. And so the lack of liquidity isn't simply a artifact of the low incomes in Nicaragua or an artifact of a lack of interest in the market. It is by design to some degree to maintain a low liquidity market because they don't want houses to become the skyrocketing commodity that they are in the United States. They want them to be things that families are able to own and hold on to and keep family homes and keep more people in houses and fewer people moving between houses. It's a different type of market, and that is one of the main reasons why the prices of homes and properties stay so low here and are so high in the US, and yet people in the US are often more likely to be able to buy a home at a younger age. Completely different factors with completely different outcomes. Thank you so much for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. It's like Patreon, comes directly to me, helps pay for the cameras and software and licensing and all the things we do for this channel. And as always, get in those comments and say hello, ask questions there, get in our show notes, the individual episode notes, and all of our social media, email, and how to send in a video of yourself to be on the show, like we had yesterday with the video about the beers, is all in there. And of course, join us on Thursdays for our live stream. I will see all of you tomorrow.